Hello, everyone. Welcome to working with XcodeKit. So this is my first time at SwiftLeeds and my first time speaking, so I'm very excited to be here. So like many of you, I love making apps, and whether it's for my day job or working on personal projects, I found myself running into the same types of problems when it came to navigating and working with my source code. So as I was searching for solutions, I discovered XcodeKit and source editor extensions, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Just a little bit about me before we get started. My name is Aryaman Sharda. I've been building apps since 2015. I originally started as an iOS and CarPlay engineer at Porsche, and now I'm on the iOS team at Turo. But outside of all of that, I'm an active member of the iOS community and regularly write about iOS development on my blog. I also manage the IndieWatch newsletter, which is a weekly newsletter where I interview successful independent iOS, macOS developers, and we talk about how they came up with their app idea, their marketing strategies, and any advice that they might have for other developers that are trying to create successful apps of their own. But enough about me, let's get started. So today we'll start by exploring source editor extensions and diving into their API. We'll build one from scratch, and we'll see how we can bend the rules a little bit in order to get some extra functionality out of our extensions. Lastly, we'll talk about some of the quirks that come up when distributing and installing these extensions. So just out of curiosity, has anyone here played with editor extensions before? All right, OK, nice. All right, so I bet most of you, though, are familiar with Xcode's file templates and code snippets, right? So while those are definitely useful, they're pretty limited in what they can do. And I'd argue that editor extensions sort of comes in and they fill in those gaps. So in a bit more detail here, so source editor extensions are effectively synonymous with XcodeKit, and they allow you to add custom commands to Xcode's editor menu. So you can modify the current source file, you can modify the user's selections, and you can easily navigate around within the source file. And extensions run in a separate process from Xcode, so it stays safe and stable. So what we'll do is we'll start by looking at a few examples. We'll ramp up the complexity bit by bit, just so you can get a better idea of what's possible. All right, so we'll start with the simple one. EditKit is an open source extension that I've built, but I think it has some relevant examples. So I'm sure you've all experienced how tedious it is to take a JSON response and convert it into a codable model. So what we'll do is we'll look at an extension that does that entire conversion for us, all without ever leaving Xcode. All right, so here I have a valid JSON response, but it's clearly not very readable at the moment. And we can use our editor extension to sort of fix this. So what we'll do is we'll make a selection over the JSON, and then we'll go into Xcode's editor menu, we'll pick our command, and we'll format it first. So it's worth mentioning that editor extensions can work with source code of any type. It doesn't have to be Swift or Objective-C. It can just be any kind of text-based source file. So as you can see, we've done this formatting all without leaving Xcode. And now, at least to start, we have formatted JSON. But let's take it a step further, and let's see if we can convert this into a codable model. So I'll go ahead and I'll select the JSON again. And I'll just pick a different command this time. And a second later, we have a codable model out of that JSON. And we'll just go ahead and get rid of the JSON at the bottom because we don't need it anymore. And we're just left with our codable model. We can fill in the placeholders, and we're sort of good to go. So clearly, this is not something you would be able to do with just file templates and code snippets. This kind of functionality is specific to editor extensions. And so we've gone effectively from poorly formatted JSON to a codable model, all in a few seconds, and all without leaving Xcode. Let's look at another example here. This one will help us localize any hard-coded strings in our app. So in my side projects, I'll usually put localization off until the very end. So my code often has a lot of hard-coded text like this. And it's always a pain to go back and wrap these strings in a called NS localized string, but now we can take care of that with our extension as well. So let's see. I'll go ahead and select the text that I want to localize. Again, we'll go to the editor menu, and we will pick the wrap in NS localized string, and there we go. So just a small little convenience, but if you do this kind of thing multiple times a day, that time benefit really starts to pay off. And if we were to go ahead and assign a keyboard shortcut to this command, then this process becomes even simpler. So let's kind of move on to some more advanced examples. So Swiftify is a service that helps you convert Objective-C to Swift. So here I have some open source code from Wikipedia's iOS app. It's Objective-C. So I'm just going to make a selection over the code that I want to convert. And a second later, we have Swift code in its place. So the main takeaway here is that editor extensions can also make network calls. And we can go, we can go even further. So what some people have started doing is they've started integrating GitHub Copilot and ChatGPT directly into Xcode. So that means that you don't have to go to their website anymore to ask queries. You can do all of that in place in Xcode. Now, editor extensions don't have to be all that complicated. They can be simple commands that solve specific problems in your workflow. So, for example, you could have faster navigation. You could sort of rebuild Vim key bindings to whatever degree you want to. And you can easily use editor extensions to format your code, generate boilerplate code, and automatically add mark comments to different code sections. All right, so we've got the basics covered, and we have a better understanding of what these extensions can do. So let's get started building one. So editor extensions require a host app, so we'll begin by creating a new macOS app. From there, we will go in and we'll add a new target, and this time we'll pick Xcode source editor extensions. Now, after adding the target, you'll notice that Xcode provides us with a lot of boilerplate code, but we'll take a closer look at each one by one. And as we work through these different APIs, I wouldn't worry too much about the details. I'd focus more on just trying to understand at a high level what code goes where and the general responsibilities of the different APIs. So we can group the starter code that we were given into 3 different categories: permissions, configuration, and implementation. So for permissions, we just have a simple entitlements file, and that helps us specify exactly what resources our extension has access to. For configuration, we'll use the info plist in the editor extension file to specify the commands our extension supports and the order we want them to appear in the editor menu. And then for the actual implementation, we'll use the editor command file, and that's where most of our code's going to live. So starting with permissions. So the file is fortunately really simple. Extensions have to be sandboxed in order to be loaded by Xcode. So we have to specify that our extension functions in a sandboxed environment. And if we were to not have this, Xcode would just completely ignore our extension. It would not attach. But don't worry, though. We'll see how we can work around these limitations in a minute. All right, so let's talk about configuring our extension. And this really is all about specifying the menu items in the order that they appear in. So when Xcode launches, it calls our editor extension implementation, which is where the bulk of our configuration happens. This is where we'll run whatever setup code we need to run, and this is where we'll specify the commands that are currently available in our app. So if, for example, you allow the user to turn commands on and off in the host app, you can honor those preferences here by only returning the currently available commands. So taking a closer look at the API, we have our extension did finish launching, which is sort of where we can do any initial setup work. But typically, I've found that you don't really actually need to do anything here. Most of this is taken care of in other places in the flow. Now, when it comes to actually specifying the commands that we support, we have 2 options. We can either specify them in the command definitions file, a property here, which is great if you want to selectively turn commands on and off, or we can just do it in the info plist, which I think is way simpler, and that's my preferred approach. But the catch is that all of these settings are applied when Xcode launches and loads up your extension. So that means if you wanted to dynamically have different commands available based on the type of source file, that's not something you can currently do. So any of the settings that you specify here are sort of there for the entirety of Xcode's lifetime. So if you were to opt for the command definitions approach, here's how it works. You'll start by using the command name key to specify the class responsible for handling each command. And because a single editor extension can have multiple commands in it, we'll need a unique identifier so we know exactly which one we're working on. And then finally, we'll give each command a name, just so that way it appears in Xcode's editor menu in a readable way. And it's important to keep in mind that if you go down this command definitions approach, it's going to override whatever you specify in your info plist. So here's the info plist version. It's way simpler, but you'll see the same fields appearing: class name, command identifier, command name. So you can specify that here if you don't need to turn commands on and off. And it's also worth noting that whatever order you specify here is the order those commands will appear in Xcode. All right, so we have the configuration finished, and our extension now has a list of supported commands and knows the order that they should appear. So we'll sort of dive in now into the third category of files, the ones we'll be working with for the majority of the implementation. All right, so when the user selects a command, Xcode will create a command invocation object for us. And what this really is it's just, it contains some metadata about the file that's open, and it contains the text buffer, which is the actual source, which is the actual text in the file. And Xcode will automatically create this for us. We just have to use it. And it's really this class that kicks off this whole editor extension experience. So, So as we saw in previous examples, since editor extensions can have multiple commands, we need to make sure that we're running the right code for the right command that was selected. So we have the command identifier property for that. And then easily the most important property in this whole experience, the text buffer. And we'll look at this more closely in just a minute, but in simple terms, it allows us to read and modify the contents of the source file programmatically. All right, so now let's turn our attention to the text buffer. So a text buffer is essentially just a data structure that lets us modify the text contents and the text selections in our current source editor. So whatever window is currently open in Xcode. It's essentially just an in-memory representation of the contents of the file. And we can see here that it gives us a ton of information about spaces and tabs and different styling properties of our file, but that's not really relevant for the examples we'll look at. So we're just going to skip over it for now. But here are the here are the more important properties. So we have this content UTI property, which tells us the type of source file. Are we dealing with plain text, Swift code, HTML, JSON? So we can look to that property for that. And this class also includes the lines in the text as just an array of strings. And since Xcode can support multiple selections, we have a selections array that tells us all of the current selections the user has made in the file. And then finally, we have the complete buffer. And the really important takeaway here is that the lines and complete buffer properties are linked. So if you make a change in one, it's going to be reflected in the other. But we'll use all of this when we build our extension. All right, the final piece, and then we'll actually get into some real code, is the editor command. So far we've covered how to get the context information from Xcode so we know what command was selected, and we know how to access the text in the source file through the text buffer, and now what we have to do is sort of bring everything together and provide Xcode with the modified text. And that's what we'll do in the editor command. So to do this, it's actually really simple. We just have to implement this protocol, and it just has one function. So whenever the user selects one of our commands, we'll get the command invocation object, courtesy of Xcode, and a completion handler. And as we've discussed, command invocation just contains the text buffer, the metadata about the current source file, and then the completion handler is how we tell Xcode that our extension is done. And we'll use it in case there's an error, and we'll also use it just in case we finish execution normally. But fortunately, Xcode provides this implementation for us in the starter code as well. So we've done all of the groundwork. Let's get to coding. So here's the problem I want to solve. During a normal workday, I find myself copying code snippets from Xcode and then using them in documentation, Slack messages, Jira tickets, or in code review comments. And I always wrap these snippets with those backticks to get that markdown formatting. So instead of looking like this, it looks like this. But if you're doing this dozens of times a day, manually adding those backticks to get the right formatting can start to feel just a little bit annoying. So wouldn't it be just way more convenient if we had a new copy function in Xcode that added the styling automatically? So let's go ahead and build that. All right, so we're back in our editor command now. We have our text. We have the completion handler, so we're good to get started. The first thing we'll do is we'll grab the currently selected text. And since Xcode allows multiple selections, we're going to assume that the first chunk of selected text is the one that we want to work with. So here we're grabbing the list of selections from the buffer. We're taking the first one, and we're throwing an error if it doesn't exist. Next, we'll use that selection to determine the start and end lines of the selection, and we'll use that to create an NS range. Next, we'll just grab the lines that just belong to that range from our text buffer, and we'll put it into a string array. And again, we'll call the completion handler if there's an error. Now, we'll flatten our array of strings into a single string using joined. We'll use string interpolation to kind of add that string to pasteboard string, which already has all of this markdown formatting applied. And then the rest of the code is just setting it to the pasteboard and calling the completion handler with nil, because in this case, there's no error. So if we want to see this in action here, I'm just picking some text snippet, right? This could be that I want to share it on GitHub or in a Slack message, right? Activating our command. And if I go over to like a markdown environment, I have that formatting already applied. So when it comes to testing editor extensions, it's a little bit different than testing your normal app. The first thing you have to do, and it's not documented anywhere, but your extension won't show up unless you do this, is you have to go into your project settings and embed and sign XcodeKit. I wish it was documented. It isn't, but I've wasted several hours trying to figure this out. But just make sure to do that. Next, make sure that you selected the extension as what you're currently running, not the hosting app. And then when you hit run, Xcode's going to ask you this really stupid question, and it's, where do you want to run your Xcode editor extension? You can only ever run in Xcode, so it's pretty redundant to have this here. But we'll address this in a minute. When it finally does launch, you'll see that another Xcode window opens, but this one will have this identifier over it, and that's how you know it's sort of this debug version of Xcode that's just there to test your extension. And if you were to do this kind of development before Xcode 15, instead of having this blue Xcode with an ID over it, it's just a grayscale version of the Xcode logo in previous versions. So your original version of Xcode will continue to run through this process, so that way you can debug, check the console output, and just more accurately test what you're building. Now, it's only going to be this debug version of Xcode that has your extension installed, and you would just test it in the same way that we did all of the examples before. So to make testing a little bit more convenient, you can just edit the scheme for your extension and set Xcode as the default executable. That way you won't have to manually specify it every time. And then while you're here, you can also go into the Arguments tab and specify some default project that you want to use. So here I just have the path to some project that I did recently, and now Xcode will automatically open this up every time I go to test my extension. So far we've seen what's possible within kind of the confines of a sandboxed app. We can make network calls, we can access the clipboard, and we can make modifications to the source file. But as long as we're in the sandboxed environment, we'll be limited in our access to the file system, system services, the terminal, and pretty much everything else. I mean, at this point, our extension doesn't even know the path to the file that it's working on. So if our goal is to create extensions for our workflows to make them as convenient as possible, then we can break the rules a little bit to get some extra functionality out of them. I bet this isn't where you thought I was going, is it? Well, it turns out we can use AppleScript to help our extensions execute code outside of the sandbox. And the real trick here is that if you store these AppleScripts in your project's specific application script directory, then you can trigger them from your extension. So if you or your team, use scripts, like just normal scripts for tasks like managing translations, releases, linting, formatting, you can just wrap those in AppleScript and then trigger those directly from Xcode. And if you're working with the team, you can easily share these scripts that you make with your colleagues, so that way everyone can kind of benefit from that behavior. The one kind of catch here is that this has to be a secondary step. Right? You would install the app from the App Store, or someone in your team gives you a self-signed version of it, and then once it's all installed and good to go, you would have to sort of add these AppleScripts in as a secondary step. But you could also just create an installed script that downloads those from a shared repository, for example. So in this video, in just a minute, we'll use this AppleScript approach to create a new extension that opens a terminal directly to our Xcode project. And it turned out that my screen recording software hides notifications that take place while I'm doing the recording. But there is, after the terminal launches, there is a notification that comes in just to prove that you get some basic UI elements. So you'll just have to take my word for it that if I wasn't recording, it would work. But yeah, let's go ahead and play. Right, so usually I would have to do this manually and several times a day, but now you can just do that directly from whatever project you have open in Xcode. But taking a step back, this shows us that we can access the file system, terminal, a little bit of UI, all of the things that we didn't have access to in our original sandboxed implementation. And at this point, our main app and our extension still operate in the sandbox, which means you could still distribute it on the App Store and just have the user install those scripts as a secondary step. And we can use this AppleScript approach for other tasks as well. So for example, you could easily create one that just lets you delete derived data in one click, or one that opens a current file in GitHub. I mean, there's tons of possibilities. And just taking a step back, our normal editor extension still doesn't even know the file path to the file we're in, right? So we've really unlocked like a lot of possibilities with this two-pronged approach here. This isn't a talk about AppleScript. I would not do that to you, but it's worth mentioning that we got all of this with just two short functions. One retrieves the path to the current project that's open in Xcode. The other one opens a terminal, sort of CD it into that path. And it's pretty easy to build this kind of functionality without writing a ton of code. And also, ChatGPT happens to be pretty good at AppleScript. So that made it easier. Yeah, but let's see how we would add this to our extension. So we have our AppleScript written. It's in our application scripts directory. Let's see how we call it from our extension. We'll start by grabbing the path to the application script file, and we'll just append the name of the script that we want to run. Then we'll just do a little bit of file validation, and we'll load it into an NS user AppleScript task, so that way we can work with it. And then we just simply execute it. And in this case, we just want the default behavior. So this is sufficient. We just wait on it to finish, and then it works just like you saw in the video. The terminal launches, the notification comes in, and then you just pick up where you left off in Xcode. Now, I can't take credit for figuring this AppleScript stuff out. All of the credit here should go to Koa and Boris. I came across a blog post a few months ago and where they sort of shared this approach, and the implementation that you saw is sort of just built off of their groundwork. And as a total coincidence, I was looking at the attendee list for SwiftLeeds, and it turns out that Koa, who I've never met, but is actually here. So if that's the case, thank you for all the groundwork that you did on this. Yeah, and if you want more examples of what you can do with the AppleScript approach, you can check out Koa's open source extension, Xcode way. So tons of examples in there. Yeah, let's briefly talk about distribution now. So since editor extensions require this host macOS app anyway, that's a great spot to put preferences for your editor extensions. Like the one use case that I've seen in a previous project was someone built an extension that would let you wrap lines that exceed a certain length. And they let you configure what that length is in the host app because the editor extension can't show a UI of its own, so you have to offload all of that behavior somewhere else. So the host app is a great place to do all that. And then in terms of distribution, you can do that via the Mac App Store like you normally would, or you can also self-sign with your own developer ID. Now, there's actually a fairly active community building editor extensions. So if you're looking for more examples or want to contribute to existing open source projects, this is a great place to start. You'll find plenty of inspiration here. So many of the examples that we looked at today came from the editor extension that I've been working on for the last few months. So you can find all of the code for everything you've seen today here. And yeah, if you're interested, please feel free to contribute. But yeah, let's quickly touch on the installation process. So if you've recently downloaded an editor extension from the App Store, or you're exploring some open source project, there's just one additional step you have to take to get it up and running. After you launch it the first time, it'll be available in system preferences. You have to go in and toggle it on, and only then will it show up in Xcode after you restart. But after that, it'll be available in all of your projects. And I think this is like this like single slide has helped me the most to sort of speed up my workflow. If you find yourself reusing the same commands, I would just set up key bindings for them in Xcode's Xcode settings panel. So now you don't have to go into the editor menu, click, and find that command. You can just pick whatever shortcut you like and go from there. And just to recap, so we talked about source editor extensions. We built our own. We talked about ways of getting additional functionality out of them. And then we talked a little bit about distribution and installation. So yeah, I hope that this talk has inspired, has sparked your interest in editor extensions and inspired you to create your own. You can find the slides and links to the code here. And I'll have a more thorough blog post about all of this later on. And yeah, if you do decide to create your own extensions, I'd love to see it. Please don't hesitate to reach out through any social media platform. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is my first time at SwiftLeeds and my first time speaking, so just wanted to say another big thanks to Adam and the SwiftLeeds team for having me. And yeah, if there's any questions.